Mary and Neil Anderson had been married for 7 years. Unfortunately, having gone through many hardships in her life, she was now forced to endure her husband's reproaches almost every morning. "The business and the house are mine now, and you can go clean the toilets for all I care," Neil growled. Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. The woman resented her husband so much that deep down, she was ready to abandon everything and just leave. "I wasted 7 years of my life on him," Mary thought with tears in her eyes. Some people may think that 7 years isn't a long time, but others see it as a rather impressive achievement in a relationship. During this time, the young people had been through a lot. Inadvertently, Mary plunged into the memories that were so clear that it felt as if they happened just yesterday. Back when they first met, Neil and Mary were seniors at college and didn't have a cent to their names. Being the best student in their year, Mary worked as a tutor, giving lessons to kiddos who were about to start college or those who had already started it but couldn't handle the schoolwork. Unfortunately, tutoring didn't bring Mary a lot of money, but it did help her stay afloat. The young woman's parents died in a plane crash 15 years ago, and she was raised by her grandmother ever since. Neil, on the contrary, grew up in a full family and was used to being in the spotlight from an early age. It's hard to say what exactly Neil saw in the modest young woman. As the captain of the varsity football team, Neil never lacked female attention and affection. He was probably most attracted to her intelligence and only a little bit to her looks. Neil made a rash decision to study economics, which was probably a mistake because he was having a very hard time with his studies. It was then that Mary appeared in the young man's life. She started helping him in her free time. At first, neither one of the young people even thought about having a relationship, which is why the passionate love that later developed between them came as a surprise to them both. 6 months later, Neil proposed to Mary, which completely turned the head of the naive young woman who believed in romantic ideals. Having held a modest wedding celebration, the newlyweds bought a small house on the outskirts of the city, which became their family home. After graduating from university, Neil directed all of his efforts to starting his own business, which he'd been dreaming of for several years. At first, he simply resold customer goods, bought them for cheaper, and sold them at a higher price. But when Mary joined the team, Neil's business reached a fundamentally new level. Thanks to her creative approach, the young woman managed to increase the company turnover several times. Then there was more. Meanwhile, Neil's involvement in the business was rather insignificant and ineffective. The man simply couldn't calculate all the risks and think through all the details that doing business entailed. 2 years later, the family business started bringing in a steady income, which allowed the couple to buy a new house and a car. Everything was going well until the moment when Neil decided to take over the management of the firm. That was when the difficulties began. It wasn't really about the struggle for power within the family, but in all other respects, Neil's behavior became simply unbearable. First of all, it was about his attitude towards Mary, whom he started treating as nothing more than his servant. Business is for real men. I've been able to handle it on my own for a long time, but you should take a better look at the kitchen and improve your skills in this area, Neil once said at breakfast. At first, Mary treated her husband's words as some kind of a bad joke aimed at hurting her pride. But then things went too far, and she realized that Neil really considered their family business to be his brainchild. "But we started it together, dear," Mary tried to object. Unfortunately, the young woman didn't know at the time that it was only the beginning and that soon her life would change beyond recognition. Now, the Anderson family fought almost every day, and it was always Neil who started it. Criticizing everything his wife did, Neil thereby tried to assert himself at her expense. Having taken over the family finances, the businessman started staying late at work, sometimes even well over midnight. At some point, Mary noticed lipstick stains on the collar of her husband's shirt, but she didn't even ask him about it because deep down she understood that their relationship was already over. And now, smearing bitter tears all over her face, Mary reproached herself for not leaving her husband a few years earlier. Clean the toilets? Is this really Neil's gratitude for everything I've done for him? Mary thought, sobbing. Having finally managed to pull herself together, Mary packed up her things and left the house where she'd lived for 7 long years. The worst part was that Neil Anderson did nothing to get his wife to come back. He never even apologized to her. At that moment, the man was sure that he could handle everything on his own, since doing business no longer seemed hard, and he didn't think that it would require a lot of strength and energy. On top of that, Neil was having an affair. His beautiful mistress completely clouded his judgment. Meanwhile, Mary didn't really have anywhere to go. Having taken a few necessities and some money with her, the woman rented a motel room where she tried to recover and regain her former confidence. During this time, Neil couldn't even bother to find time to call his wife. Concluding one deal after another, the businessman truly believed that he was the only one responsible for the firm's success, and that his wife was a fool for not realizing that. Due to his own naivete, the businessman didn't even suspect that the firm's success depended largely on the business plan developed by his wife. For some time, Neil's business managed to stay afloat, working according to the plan that Mary had developed. Determined to break free from his past, Neil filed for divorce, which, as expected, left Mary without a cent to her name. The businessman was so self-absorbed and overly confident that he didn't even think for a second that he was doing something wrong or even shameful. Big money and power turned Neil's head, which was why he became completely careless. Now, instead of consulting with Mary, Neil listened to some crooks and people who were jealous of his position. To everyone around him, the businessman looked like a lion surrounded by hyenas, who were all just waiting to get his leftovers. But if Neil ever stumbled, they would be the first ones to rush in to finish him off. About a year and a half after the divorce, the businessman had already completely forgotten about Mary, treating their marriage as a youthful mistake. The epiphany came a little later, when several bad deals caused the firm's income to decrease significantly. That was closely followed by some problems with supplies, wage arrears, and dissatisfied workers who were forced to work virtually for nothing. Of course, like any businessman of his level, Neil tried to restore order to the firm, but that was nearly impossible to do in the absence of money. Those employees who'd been with the firm for the longest were openly telling Neil that things were much better under Mary's management. At first, Neil simply fired everyone who questioned his authority or his decisions, but when he fired half the staff, he realized that he could no longer use this tactic. On top of that, his competitors stepped up, and their companies were now flourishing, partially thanks to Neil's failed leadership. It was very unpleasant and even insulting for the businessman to admit to the fact that all this time, his wife was actually the one running his company. The truth was that ever since the company was founded, Neil always thought of himself as its leader, choosing to disregard the fact that Mary was always there to help and direct him. As the company continued to lose money, most of the employees quit and went to work at other, more successful firms. Choosing to think of everyone as traitors, Neil continued to conclude bad deals, all the while hoping to get the firm back to its former level. One day, being completely desperate, the businessman decided to hold important negotiations with representatives of one of the most successful firms that were his direct competitors. To put it simply, Neil wanted to make a deal to divide their spheres of influence, to make sure he had a safe haven where his business could continue to operate. The meeting was scheduled at a restaurant that was rightfully considered one of the best in the city. Having gotten there a little early, Neil made an order and started waiting for the other party to arrive. Finally, an expensive limousine drove up to the restaurant, and a miniature woman dressed in a business suit came out. Having made a sign to the driver, she asked him to leave the car in the parking lot, after which she entered the restaurant. Wow, did they send a woman to negotiate with me? Neil thought to himself. Imagine the businessman's surprise when he recognized that woman as his ex-wife. Neil was so surprised that he almost choked on his salad and had to take a sip of juice to calm down. "Mary, is that you? What are you doing here?" Neil asked, unable to contain his emotions. "Yes, it's really me, as you can see. They say that only strong people can succeed in business, but I don't consider myself weak, so I decided to continue doing business elsewhere," Mary answered, hiding a smile on the corners of her lips. At that moment, Neil remembered something he had been trying desperately to forget all these years. He got carried away with the firm's success and deliberately downplayed Mary's role in it, trying to pretend that it was all his doing. But life put everything in its place, and now, sitting face to face with the representative of the most successful firm in the city, Neil felt humiliated and miserable. At that moment, he would have gladly disappeared off the face of the earth, just so he wouldn't have to see the mocking eyes of his ex-wife. Trying to negotiate some sort of a safe haven for his business, Neil quickly realized that his plan was naive at the very least. Mary, on the other hand, spoke with her ex-husband from a position of power and didn't agree to a single point Neil proposed. Moreover, Mary managed to take over what Neil wasn't actually planning on giving away. As it turned out, Mary didn't waste time and got a job at a competing company after the divorce. After she joined the team, the company flourished and started to bring in some solid income. The owner of the company immediately noticed the talented young woman, and being a single man, asked her to marry him. To Mary's credit, she didn't rush with her answer. It was only after she made sure that the man's feelings were sincere and his intentions were good that the businesswoman accepted his proposal. Thus, sitting in front of Neil wasn't just a representative of the competing company, but its rightful owner. Unlike Neil, her new husband turned out to be a caring and considerate man who surrounded Mary with love and attention and didn't hesitate to hand over the reins of the company to her fragile hands. Having heard Mary's story, Neil completely lost heart. Then he noticed something that he didn't see when Mary first walked in. The loose fit of Mary's suit was hiding a small tummy, which was clear confirmation that she was pregnant. "If you want, I can buy out the controlling stake in your company and save it from bankruptcy." Mary was the first one to break the silence. "What will happen to me then?" Neil asked immediately. "Well, I can offer you the position of a security guard or a janitor." "I'm sorry, but you can't be trusted with anything more important," Mary answered and signed for the waiter to bring the check. Neil turned pale, then got up from the table and headed for the exit, shuffling the soles of his shoes. He couldn't come to terms with the fact that he'd just suffered the most painful defeat of his life. He'd lost the company, he knew that, but there was nothing he could do about it. Having betrayed Mary, he betrayed himself, and now he was reaping the fruits of his hasty decisions. At the end of this amazing story, it's worth saying that Mary fulfilled her promise and saved Neil's firm from bankruptcy. But the man knew that he couldn't count on getting back on good terms with her, and a while later, he went completely off the radar of the business world.